Welcome, Stevens community. Welcome, welcome on this 12th day of August, 2020. Welcome to the Think, Speak, Do Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. This is webinar 8 of 9. What a journey we've been on. I am Shaashawn Dial. I serve as the inaugural Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Stevens College, and I'm also a very proud alumna. We have an incredible guest facilitator. But before that, welcome to all of our Stevens constituents that comprise our community. So welcome to our residential undergraduate students Zooming in from all over the country. We want to welcome our fully online students Zooming in from all over the country, and our graduate students as well for Zooming in. We want to welcome faculty and welcome them back to campus because many of them return to campus this Monday. So welcome faculty, welcome staff who've been on campus almost about 4 weeks now. So we welcome you to this Zoom. Of course, we welcome Board of Trustee members. Thank you for your service. We welcome all of our alumnus, alumni to this. And then of course, members of our Columbia, Missouri communities, and also communities from all over, because we could have folks tuning in again from Pennsylvania, because that's where our guest facilitator is a resident of. So our guest facilitator today is Nick Miron, and Nick is a man on a journey. He's an aspiring ally, a son, a husband, a father of 2, a daughter in college, and a son in his senior year of high school. Nick is currently a resident of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. He's an appreciator of all things nature, especially mountains. He's a July 25th kind of Leo. He studied at Millersville University. He's an aspiring sommelier, an aspiring ally, and one of my favorite, my favorite white male co-facilitator in doing social justice work. Nick serves as a core trainer at Roots of Justice, formerly known as Damascus Road, an organization that provides space for individual communal transformation via programs that are designed to work towards long-term transformation of institutions through the work of teams to dismantle institutional racism. Roots of Justice offers a variety of education, communication, anti-racism experiences. They can be organizing workshops, caucusing retreats, and they vary from 3 hours to full weekend intensive sessions, which I've had the pleasure to study in. And Roots of Justice provides individuals and organizations an analysis and a solid framework and foundation that you don't get other places to challenge systemic racism and oppression. So Roots of Justice often asks its attendees and participants, are you ready and are you willing to walk with us, with them, on a journey of justice? And then they say, what are you gonna do next? So Stevens community, please welcome, give a warm digital welcome to Nick Miron.
Thank you, Shaashawn. Pleasure to be here. Really honored by your invitation and your friendship. Glad to see you.
It's good to see you too. So Stevens community, as we know, we've been on this journey. I am not an office of one, so I get to partner with some phenomenal folks everywhere on campus, but especially Shannon Walls, who serves as our special assistant to the president and our Title IX coordinator. She is an alumna as well, and she is hard at work making sure that we meet the federal government requirements to implement new regulations regarding Title IX that have to be in place by August 14th, and they were dropped less than 90 days ago. So we want to applaud and thank Shannon for her efforts and work, and also Sadie Mayerstrand, who serves as our Director of Student Success Center and our ADA coordinator. So the 3 of us, I've branded, and we talk about equity, the 3 R's, responsibility, rights, and reporting. And you can always contact us at equity@stevens.edu. This has been the journey so far. We will not go over every line, but it has been a journey. It's our foundational journey to make sure that we are establishing communal vocabulary, frameworks, concepts, and the training will not end. So we will definitely offer opportunities to continue to learn and grow and challenge in the fall. So today's topic is white supremacy. It's okay, relax, take a deep breath. We're going to talk about that. And as always, we come as virtual community, and we need to center and ground and remember to breathe. So when it comes to centering, remember, we're coming to this space to increase our ability to call ourselves and each other, to call us in to doing this work, and to also call out from doing this work sometimes. We're coming to this space to learn how to pause, how to active listen, how to witness to others' lived and learned experiences, and then, of course, to reflect on our own. And we come as ourselves, masterpieces that are flawed. Nick, what comes up for you around centering or the practice of centering?
Essential and challenging. So often our society and our institutions and our very bodies are so uncomfortable with putting us at the center of something, and remembering that the center of something means there's things beyond it, where we've come from, where we've been, those who helped us get here. It's challenging. And 10 years ago, I certainly would not have. This is the part where I'd go, oh, well, what is this that we're doing? But my goodness, is it essential for any kind of movement, especially in contrast to what the status quo, the power is? Always to remember who we are is essential.
Absolutely. And thank you for naming that, right? That sometimes we come to things and go, why? Or this is corny, or this is mushy, or I don't have time for this. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As we move into grounding, we want to give gratitude. This is an opportunity that if you've been busy since the alarm went off, and you've been emails and calls and getting folks from destination A to B and putting out fires or creating something, that takes a lot of mental, physical, spiritual energy. And we have to remember to start our day, end our day, and all throughout the day to express gratitude. So this is your opportunity, as we are in virtual community, to be grateful. Be grateful for firsts. What a week we are living in, or last 2 weeks. We want to give gratitude to Cori Bush, the first Black woman Congresswoman from the state of Missouri. She won a incredibly close race last week. We also want to give gratitude and acknowledge Kamala Harris, who has been selected as the vice president for the presumptive Democratic ticket for the presidential election. So we know that Black female leadership matters. We know that Black women matter. And so we want to give gratitude for their individual paths and the villages that supported them in doing historic work and historic leadership. So we also want to give gratitude for our indigenous kin, for our ancestors' spirits, vibrations, energy, whatever traditions or no traditions that you embrace. We want to give gratitude. Nick, what are you grateful for today?
Challenge, growth. I had another 3-hour anti-racism training process this morning, and I think we all say it a lot, that those of us who facilitate these spaces still take something from it. And this morning that really hit home. I got quite a lot of it. And so I'm grateful for the challenge and the space that you and all the folks that you're in community with are providing to do this liberation work.
Absolutely. And building off of last week when we talked about anti-Blackness, we want you to be grateful for Blackness, right? We want to resist against the negative adjectives that tend to be associated with Blackness, and we want to celebrate it. We want to celebrate Beyonce and her Black is King. If you haven't watched it, it's phenomenal. Watch it. But we just want to celebrate Blackness. And now we move to breathing. So remember that in moments of awkwardness, defensiveness, tension, trying to relearn or reframe or reclaim ourselves or community or spaces, that breath is really important. It releases toxins, it lowers blood pressure, it allows us to bring in oxygen and to just be grateful for these bodies that we were given to navigate the world with. So Nick, if you will lead us through a quick breathing exercise, we'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. So this is a breathing space and time, somewhat meditative, and I'll go through some of the reasons that it's necessary later. What I invite you to do is find a spot to anchor yourselves in your seat. And place your feet on the floor, place your arms in the rest or a comfortable position, and your back against the back of your chair. I invite you to close your eyes or find a neutral spot on the floor or a tabletop, and begin to gently push your feet against the floor, just slightly, and then release and feel your body just sink a bit into the seat. Slow your mind, slow your breathing. Try to find a quiet space. Feel the breath entering all the nooks and crannies of your body. Deeply inhale, pause, and release, letting go all the stale air. Find a moment of peace. One more inhale. And release. When you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes, rejoin your surroundings, your environment, and our little community here today. Thank you, Shaashawn, for giving that space and opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So hopefully you all are really embracing these community agreements and knowing that they can be when we are in face-to-face facilitated environments, when we are digitally sharing information. So let's go through them quickly. If you don't know, Google, right? Or as Sarah Crosby, one of our former co-facilitators said, RTDB, read the damn book. Meaning when we are doing social justice work, you must assume the responsibility to go seek out information, to go put yourself in spaces, to go and be uncomfortable and maybe be the small in number. So before you go run to someone for them to do the work for the emotional labor of educating you. Nick, can you take us through the next one?
Of course. It's important to know how you move typically. So ambiverts can go back and forth between introversion and extroversion. So continue to do so. Extroverts and introverts, if that's how you tend to be, we're going to ask you to challenge yourself to maybe act in different ways. So extroverts, if you're used to getting your voice out there and heard, maybe take a step back. Doesn't mean you can't have your voice out there, but take a step back and let other voices enter the space. Introverts, this really is a challenge for you, maybe, or not challenge, a chance, a chance for you to take a risk and put your voice into a space. So we're just going to ask you to be mindful of yourself, how you move, and maybe move in contradictory ways.
Yes. Keep going for us, Nick.
Uncomfortability. Racism and white supremacy will not end comfortably. So we have to be willing and intentional around discomfort, defensiveness, and being okay with being uncomfortable, and acknowledging when we are defensive and trying to not be so. Awkwardness, this is all standard. Especially for white folks. A lot of our ego gets in the way. So be mindful of how our egos are showing up. That's what leads to defensiveness.
Absolutely. So we will honor confidentiality in this space, meaning if someone shares an identity or a specific lived experience, we're not going to go run out, right, and tell that unless we get permission from that person. We're not here to violate anyone. Many of us have had too many violations mentally, physically, spiritually, so we don't want to perpetrate that. So we have to get permission. However, in the words of Anissa Ward, what is learned here needs to leave here, right? So concepts, definitions, connections to material, we absolutely want you to leave and go run and tell that. Nick, pick it up for us.
I am still seeing the first slide.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Okay. All right.
Did it move again?
Nope. That was sit in uncomfortability, I think is that on there again?
Yeah, it's in there again.
Sorry about that. That's my
That's
fault.
okay. And the practice active listening.
Active listening as much as possible. Yes. I don't think I need to elaborate much more on that. A lot of us are familiar with the words active listening. So it's important to try and do that, focusing on what we're talking about, trying to let distractions in our house. My son came down for food. My cat will jump on my lap. So trying to take ourselves away from those distractions as much as possible.
Awesome. So social justice work is just like anything else, right? It's got keystones, cornerstones, it's got key foundations and beliefs. So Nick, lead us in this one, please.
All right. So racism is, and we'll go through some definitions later, but it's not what a lot of people think it is, especially white people. It involves power, and it is everywhere. So one of the questions that often comes up in these kinds of spaces is, how do I respond to racism when I see it? Now I know what it is, I'm looking for it. How do I respond? And that's a good question, and it's a bit misleading because racism is everywhere. And so the question can go from, how do I respond when I see it, to how do I identify what racism is right here where I am? Because it's always around us everywhere we go. So pervasive is the exact word for it. Racism built our society, white supremacy right along with it. And so it's in everything that we see, wherever you are. You take a look around to your left, to your right, the walls, the structures, the computers that we use, technology, everything involves racism in some way. Because it's so pervasive, that also means that it affects all of us, even me as a white man. And it's important to understand it not in the same way, but it's dehumanizing to us all. And so we all have, I guess, pun intended, skin in the game. There's liberation is what that something is. Liberation is for all of us to attain. You've probably heard the quote, if some of us aren't free, none of us are free. That's the way racism works. That's what it does to us. And so there's something that we all have a stake in this, which means we also all have a role. And what that role is what we'll be going over during our time today.
Absolutely. And you're on a roll, right? So racism is both a system of oppression and a system of advantage based on skin color. What about this, Nick? Racial prejudice was taught to us. Can we resist that teaching? Can we choose to unlearn it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely we can. It's interesting too, because I think a lot of people want to see ourselves as non-prejudice. And so it's not necessarily to undo all of our prejudice, because I will be prejudiced in ways I don't even know about for many, many years, probably my life. But if we don't begin to unlearn that, well, let me start with this. If we don't know that we are, we'll still act on that, which is discrimination, right? So first we become aware that we have prejudice. Once we do, we can then begin to unlearn those pieces so that we don't do the stereotyping, we don't do the discrimination based on what prejudices we have.
Absolutely. So you didn't invent racism. I didn't either. It is a legacy that we inherited. Neither of us, though we are creative people, we didn't create it. However, do we have to accept responsibility for its continued existence?
Absolutely.
So statements like, my grandparents didn't own slaves, or I don't understand what you mean, I'm poor and I'm white, so how could I, be engaged in this racism thing? How does that land upon you as a white male?
Those are all the ways that white folks sidestep the work that we have to do. That mindset, I believe, comes from the idea that racism is here but not here, and so as long as I'm here, I'm okay. And since we didn't own slaves, we weren't in that kind of racism, then I'm okay to operate here, which is really just a not clear understanding of what racism is and just how pervasive it actually is. So those are all the ways that we sidestep color blindness, reverse racism, all these labels and terms we use to say what racism isn't.
Absolutely. And so obviously we've put racism as the forefront. We also acknowledge that prejudice and oppressions are intertwined. So racism, sexism, our community's been exposed to the cage of oppression that you and I have each facilitated several times together. And so sexism, racism, transphobia, Islamophobia, right, ableism are all connected and entangled.
Yep. And occurring concurrently. I'm a white man at the same time, so they're always feeding off of each other, whiteness and gender oriented, all connected and all happening at the same time.
Absolutely. So diversity, equality, and equity. We've talked about this community, and so really, I affectionately say we're DEE moving towards DEI, right? So we're nowhere near the inclusion part yet, but we are definitely getting more comfortable, I think, in our different constituencies that come together to be a community to acknowledge that we are bringing all this to the table. So as we just talked about isms and phobias, we're talking about being able to bring your whole self, your sexual orientation, geography, gender expression, faith or no faith, veteran status to the table. We want to be a community that does not operate in equality. We got to get through it on our way to equity, but we don't want to treat everyone the same because that ignores that no one has been treated the same, especially certain communities, when it comes to our U.S. social institutions. We are definitely striving towards being equity-minded in our delivery of course materials, in how we interact with students and each other as staff members, how students, right, interact with each other in the classroom, be that virtual or in person. So we want to account for the differences in individuals and groups, especially their access, right, to resources, opportunities, which is power. So we've got to be color conscious. We have to talk about the impacts of inequities and imbalances and know that they're not the fault of the individual, right? That it's a system that has created that over time. We want to be the people who are questioning patterns, right? And we don't want to assume it, again, it's individual fault. We want to say maybe it was the underperformance of the system or the org. So Nick, when you see things like diversity, equality, equity, what comes up for you?
Especially equality is a lot of diversionary tactics again, because not everybody needs the same. And I would say, since you asked, even equity, it gives people what they need, but does not in it of itself eliminate the source of the need. And so even when we look at equity, we're not getting at liberation, because liberation would be eliminating barriers completely, whereas equity gets at giving people what they need based on historical oppression, but doesn't actually eliminate the oppression at the root. So it's complex.
It is. So thank you. That's why it's a journey, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And again, reviewing U.S. social institutions, this is power. So Nick named it within the first 2 minutes of our gathering. So we're talking about access, resources, opportunities when it comes to government, medicine, finance and banking, religion, media, education, and our legal and law enforcement. U.S. social institutions, Nick, is that something, well, what does that do for you when it comes to talking about social justice in your journey?
It brings to mind the challenge that we all have in navigating the work of seeking liberation, the work of anti-racism. When we're looking at these massive structures, institutions, and systems that you have listed there, and we're just an individual. So overwhelming is a feeling a lot of people feel when beginning or even doing this work for years. It can feel overwhelming at times. That's okay. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's huge. But when we begin to work as a collective, these systems get a lot more manageable. And so one of the ways we do that is by exactly this process, coming together in shared spaces of community and learning, where we can begin to operate as a collective and on ourselves. So we're doing it simultaneously.
All right, come on with the and both. You know that. So groundwater approach, this is maybe the third or fourth time we've exposed this to you. And when Nick and I were organically putting, this presentation or facilitation together, you said that this resonated with you,
Yes.
right? The ability to see it in different areas. How did it resonate with you?
Some years ago, I went to I use air quotes a lot, diversity seminar, and they had it at a movie theater near where I live. And they had the concurrent workshops and breakout sessions. And one of the breakout sessions was called the African American Achievement Gap. And so just that language of achievement gap, and I saw it here, and I always think about that story because it sounds so, and words, innocuous, is that the word? It sounds untraumatic. I'm not sure what innocuous, it sounds very benign, that's the word. It sounds benign. There's an achievement gap, almost as though it's a phenomenon of some kind. What makes it even more problematic was that it was called the African American Achievement Gap, but not one solution. It was a solution-oriented workshop. Not one solution mentioned race, which I thought was really, really troubling, and I just didn't understand because it had African American in the title. So our society is really, really good at hiding and relabeling what is caused by oppression. So I love this slide.
Thank you for that piece of hiding. And then how do you see this as a tool? How do you use this?
Yeah, this is a great image, and I've seen this one done many different ways. I like it because it has the curvature, so it's not just tiered levels. I'm an individual, so I have race-based feelings within myself, and I think and act and operate within a racist construct in different ways. At the same time, I'm navigating relationships. So I saw you recently, Shaashawn, and so there's a relationship there that crosses race and gender and all kinds of areas of oppression. And so the way I am as an individual then impacts you as an individual. That's at the same time. And then, we've both done work in similar institutions. And so as we're going in, we're feeding off of that, and it's feeding us. And then the system, so it's all happening at the exact same time, but we're so good at trying to parcel it out and just focus on one at a time, which makes it all the more challenging, I think.
Absolutely. So we are living in historic, her-storic, their-storic, them-storic times. And so we wanted to share visuals, right? To remember and bring this home, that this isn't in a vacuum. This is in theory. We're not reflecting upon a previous civil rights movement. We are continuing to navigate a global pandemic and a systemic justice revolution. So there's some images there. White silence equals white consent. White supremacy is terrorism, right? Stop labeling or protecting your racism as patriotism. That one was my favorite. White supremacy stole our liberty. What did these images, why did we pick these, Nick?
Some of these signs are just great. I too love that stop pretending your racism is patriotism one. White supremacy is terrorism, because it changes the narrative of the ways that we're taught to feel comfortable with being patriotic or understanding what we think of as terrorism. We don't think of white men like myself committing acts of terrorism. We call them mentally ill. And so these challenging these signs challenge the narrative that we're often ascribed to. The other thought I have is the white supremacy stole our liberty. The first time I saw that, it appears to be a white person holding the sign, and I always think it's interesting the language that white people use. I'm not sure our liberty was necessarily stolen, but I understand where the sign's coming from. So it's complex. Complex is the word that so often comes up for me.
Absolutely. And speaking of changing the narrative, We ask you all out there, you can feel free to put it in the chat, or we just want you to think about it as one of the takeaways, nuggets from this time is, what have you heard? Or maybe more importantly, what have you not heard about white supremacy? Is it a concept you've been able to define? Or is this maybe one of the first handful of times that it's actually being presented to you? So go ahead, Nick, define white supremacy for us.
All right. So white supremacy is the values, norms, and ways of being that overvalue and place a superior status to whiteness, especially coming from European culture. It describes the way we live, the way we think, the language we use and dress, the understanding of power and our relation to it, all the pieces of our culture, time dominance, and I think we'll get to one of those articles later, white supremacy culture, but all the ways that we think we're supposed to be, and that we see each other and the way we see ourselves, giving a lot of preference to and overvaluing those views from whiteness and European culture. One of the things that I've begun to understand recently is that you could actually eliminate racism and still have a white supremacy. Because while white supremacy takes power, it doesn't take intent. And so we could actually set up a world, and this goes back to your equality and equity slide. We could set up a world where we have equity and people getting what they need and everything's great. Racism is a thing of the past. We can actually use the term post-racial and mean it. But that doesn't mean that we've eliminated white supremacy, which is the ways of understanding professionalism and dress codes, which adhere to European-based standards and norms, and then transferred here as white. So it's all the tangible and intangible aspects of society and culture that prefer white European descended ways of being.
Absolutely. So, I love going to female Black scholars, right? So Bell Hooks, her definition, as we search as a nation for constructive ways to challenge racism and white supremacy, it is absolutely essential that progressive female voices gain a hearing. Also, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, white supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief or the investment in the inherent superiority of some, while others are believed to be innately inferior. This is my favorite part. And it doesn't demand the individual participation of the singular bigot. It is a machine operating in perpetuity because it doesn't demand that somebody be in place driving. So for me, that was an evolution of overt and covert. Mm-hmm. And I know you've got a nugget to drop soon when we get to that slide, right? But I love the fact that this gave me an image that there isn't just one person driving this white supremacy vehicle, right? It is the machine itself drives on autopilot, right?
Absolutely, autopilot, yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So take us through this one, agents of socialization.
All right, so socialization is the process through which we learn white supremacy. And certainly we're all subjected to this, and it's very different depending on our own personal identity. So as a white man, I learned white supremacy in very implicit ways. From the faith groups my parents, I'll say, subjected me to when I was young, to the places where I worked, to my schooling. Certainly that came before the work. And then whatever, movies and now social media, those were all telling me how society is supposed to be arranged, and then they reinforce each other, and then they make sure I get the lesson by taking things from me if I don't adhere to it. And so that could be relationships that I've lost because I didn't really appreciate what they thought was a joke, and so I said something. To work and loss of a job or getting written up at a job because you stand in the way of of the way it's, and I use air quotes a lot, supposed to be. So this socialization is happening from everywhere, all at the same time and through our whole life. So I wish you could take this and make it a 3D model, because it's just surrounding us, right? And it's constantly reinforcing itself. And for white folks, if we're not aware of how we've been socialized to understand white supremacy, then we will inevitably perpetuate it. Because, and I'm glad there's other definitions, I think they both talked about unconscious and lack of intent. You don't need to have intent. You don't need to have consciousness of it. And so if we're not aware of what it means for us to be white and the roles that whiteness played in shaping not just our sense of the world, but even our sense of ourselves, and then also our sense of others, we will perpetuate that unconscious learning and the ways that we navigate our work interpersonally, institutionally, and systemically.
So Nick, I think just to stay here and pause for a moment, like, can you think of an example of a way in which you began to do that introspection? Like, how did you start to reflect on your socialization? Like, and I've obviously, been with you and heard you facilitate. I've been a student, we've co-facilitated, and when did you start thinking about masculinity, or the ways that the world was telling you how to be a masculine white male, or, how to, just how, like, what were the interventions or the people that started you on that journey? I think that's so challenging for so many people, and especially white folks, to go look at their socialization. How do they begin?
Sure. Yeah, for me, I first understood it when I was young, and I understood it through masculinity. I was not I'll use air quotes again, a boy's boy. I was not a man's man when I was young. And I played soccer growing up from kindergarten through high school. And I was unfortunately one of the few people that I never cared if I won or lost the game. I always had fun. I just loved to play. And that was a theme that went all the way through. I played soccer as an adult. A couple years ago, I played an indoor league. And I still had teammates yelling at me because they wanted me to do something better or different. But going back to my youth, I was picked on a bit in school because I didn't have that aspiring manhood thing I'm supposed to have. And so I remember that very clearly. Communication is another one that I think I talk about when we facilitate together in terms of race. Different styles of communication, indirect versus direct. And I recognized early on that my father's family and my mother's family, even though all white, different communication because one of the reasons being my father's family was Jewish. And so, Jews are passionate people, can be. And so we vocalize and our voices go up and we use hands sometimes. We actually point fingers. That's the thing we do most. We point fingers because we're pretty damn sure we're right, even if we don't know what we're talking about. And so my father's family would navigate conversations in a way that made my mother's family uncomfortable. And I was quickly able to see the race behind that when I started doing anti-racism work, because some of the folks that I worked with, BIPOC and women of color, and I just talked to our friend Angelique this morning.
Yes.
And I was telling the group there a story of when Angelique and I first started, and Angelique is a Jew-Rican, Puerto Rican Jewish from Brooklyn. And she spoke very directly to me about something. And my first reaction was, the defensiveness that you had in the slide earlier. Like, oh, wow. And then I was like, oh, okay, we're in a relationship. It's a good thing. I was so accustomed to my family's very indirect, even my father's family, passionate, loud, but not often when it came to interpersonal relationships, not direct in saying how they felt or thought. And so the socialization, I grew up thinking that there were certain ways to communicate, there are certain ways to act, to dress. It's powerful. And I'm still getting over that stuff. That's the thing that is disheartening. I still have those messages in my head. Because even as an adult, and I don't want to spend too much time on this one thing, that as an adult, I realized that even the struggles I had as a boy, I've still, I've passed on some of those lessons that I didn't want for myself to my kids. I have a son, and so some of the things that impacted me around masculinity, I had internalized so much that I still pass some of those lessons along, inadvertently, unconsciously sometimes. But I was able to see them come out in my kids. So it's harmful.
Yes. Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for naming that these are simultaneous, I don't know, spectrums or journeys. So there's your own individual journey. There's your journey as a husband, your journey as a father, your journey as a facilitator. We've had very intimate conversations about how we view doing this work when we know we need to take a break from it. How to get compensated or not get compensated for it, right? So each of those is a journey. And you and I don't even know how many years we've known each other at this point, but we're gladfully not the same people when we met. We're different people, different facilitators. We've stopped using certain tools, evolved a tool, we created a tool together. So, I appreciate you naming the fact that this is why it's so challenging and rich and frustrating and can be scary to go back and know that we know you love your parents. And to be able to sit in that space and just say, these were the messages I got, or this was conflicting messages, or, yeah.
Or that, I asked them a couple years ago, and they're both liberal, but not anti-racist. And I went through that. I love you as parents, and still, I was like, well, you care about racism, but why didn't you actually ever talk to me about it? Like we never. So yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Awesome. So we're not going to go through this line by line. There will be a link to this article for you in the follow-up email, but both of us love this as a tool. We have not stopped using this tool, which is white supremacy culture. It's an article/study or an article from a study called Dismantling Racism, a Workbook for Social Change Groups, Kenneth Jones, Timo Kuhn, and it's around 2001 and relevant to this day. I have to pull this thing out all the time and say, oh, remember, Shaashawn, you need to challenge this in yourself, challenge this in your work. So what's listed, right, are ways that white supremacy shows up to create white culture. And we're all navigating white culture. Nick, are there any favorites of yours on this or something that kind of broke you open when you started down this path?
Either or thinking, I still got caught up in. So I tried to be intentional, and intense is a powerful word, right? I try to be intentional at avoiding either or thinking, but the socialization is so strong, of course, that I go to that often. If I'm not careful, I'll go to that first, right? And so that's actually going back to the individual, systemic institutional slide you had, the different layers of. That's one of the things that it's just so crucial to understand. Our default for us as people, especially white folks, and institutions, our default is white supremacy. No organization is benign, and no white people are benign. We're either actively anti-racist, liberation seeking, or we're perpetuating white supremacy and racism. And the challenge is that kind of gets into either or, and yet still that's what white supremacy provides for us. Because as I think it was the Dyson quote, nobody needs to be in the driver's seat. It just is. That is the standard, it's the norm. So my default is either or thinking. That's what I go to. And so I try to resist that. But I can also say about this, it's funny, a number of times that I've shown this article and talked about it with folks, and it can be easy for me as well. For people, I know somebody I used to work with, let's say, works with a written word, just like, oh yeah, that's me. I love books. Haha. And the idea is you're supposed to recognize it and work against it. But some people just kind of see themselves on there and move on. So it's challenging, but it's a great article. It has the antidotes there listed. So it's a really great article.
Absolutely. And complimenting yours is objectivity and either or thinking are just a constant loop for me. Right? So remembering bust the binary is another way of, the either or. And then the piece about objectivity, there is so much that is assumed, right? Neutrality, objectivity, that you are distanced from it, that there's a way that you can't. And I have to think of like, no, my job is to resist that. What my job is to name as many biases as I can. It's to name that I'm coming to this research project or this facilitation or this policy or whatever relationship with some stuff. The fact that we think we are not walking around with the overnight bag, right, of bias or purse or man purse or whatever you want to call it, is something that just consistently I have to monitor, because if not, it is really easy to be like, oh yeah, no, like you said, there is no neutral.
Yep.
Right? The default is the isms and the phobias. Yep. The default are these things: power hoarding, the fear of open conflict, individualism, progress is bigger or more, the right to comfort.
That's a big
the
one.
Always sense of urgency, right? Because then that means we have to prioritize things. And so then we can keep making other things just be at the bottom of the list. And we can say, well, we just didn't have time to go do it.
Yep.
So absolutely. So that'll be in your wrap-up email. So please, Nick, bless them with the nugget. What's the nugget?
So I love this slide. Roots of Justice, the group I work with that Shaashawn mentioned earlier, we use iceberg as a metaphor for our entire 20-hour program. And so I love the iceberg metaphor. And one of the things about this particular slide that I'd begun to think about recently, and it wasn't an original thought of mine, it was from reading other people's thoughts about things. And I came across somebody writing something that showed a similar slide to this that had the triangle. And we looked at that last week, Shaashawn, the triangle, so a very similar shape. This one says it too: overt and covert white supremacy. And as many times as I've used this, and I've been intentionally anti-racist for 18 years. I've done anti-racism work for 15 years. As many times as I'd seen this, I never really thought about covert and overt. And what this person was asking was, who is the covert? So below the water, who is that covert to? And I was like, oh my gosh, I've used these words. Like I've said that. It's covert to me, not so much anymore. It was at one time. And some of these things I still don't understand and recognize, but it's not covert at all to some people, BIPOC especially. And so even these tools we have that are powerful and helpful to understanding how white supremacy plays out, in and of themselves can still be perpetuating that racist perspective. Because, but what about me if somebody says that? Color blindness, and police brutality, police murdering people of color. I mean, that's not been covert to BIPOC forever, ever, and never has it been covert. Yet for a lot of white folks and in white institutions, it's been completely covert, even up until the events of the past few months with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd specifically being killed by, actively killed by active police. Even up until then, it's still been covert. So the language we have around these tools is still a sign and perpetuation of a white supremacist perspective.
And we talked about microaggressions, right? As if micro and macro, again, to whom? To the perpetrator, they may seem micro, but to the recipient, they are macro. So, you'll see in certain circles, there's movements to like cross out the micro and keep macro. But again, covert to who? To a person of color who is called a token or told you're the whitest Black person I know. There's nothing covert in that statement that they receive. So it's covert to white folks, not covert, or covert to the advantaged group, not to the disadvantaged group. Mm-hmm. So a nugget takeaway, y'all know that's what I believe in. This too will be a link in your follow-up email, so we won't go line by line because we want to make sure that we've got time to get all the goodness that Nick is here to share. But this is another key piece that we both use and love. 10 insidious ways white supremacy shows up in our everyday lives, right? And the other piece to think about is we often intentionally select work by people of color, right? So absolutely, the Peggy McIntoshes, the Jane Elliots, they are awesome. They each have their own niches, and you can learn on an individual, communal, organizational level. At the same time, there's a piece that if I only give you Jane Elliott and Peggy McIntosh on white supremacy, right, or white feminism, then I'm still perpetuating, right, that there's privilege in that. So using articles, models, quotes by folks of color, again, allows us to celebrate and highlight and embrace the lived experiences of people who have the lived experience and their scholars, or the lived experience and their practitioners and teachers, right? So this one, I have all kinds of scribbles on the original one, and I actually got this tool from Nick. He was facilitating this in a workshop I was a student in, and I was just like, where has this been all my life? Was white people like being less moved by the pain of people of color, right? I was in a former Damascus Roads, now Roots of Justice training, when I heard a facilitator say, white folks, if a Black person literally shows you their pain, which could be tears or anger that has to do with racism, you've received a gift, right? I hadn't heard that anywhere else. And that it was to try to take the numbness out of it. Because if you go just by the movies or the music, right, or your local news, and you watch that every night, which I can't do, you can become numb to the pain of people of color, specifically Black and Indigenous folks. Other things on here, are the sentencing discrepancies, Black men being sentenced to far lengthier prison sentences. Colorism comes in with white folks falsely, recall, or that they often will say that a Black man is more intelligent if he's light skinned versus if he's dark. And how colorism has played into sentencing, right? Because it's feeding into a narrative, that these Black men are scary or dangerous, or perpetrators of something, right? So that number 10, white people, these are based out of studies, view lighter skinned people of color as more intelligent, competent, trustworthy, and reliable. Well, why would that be? And that's because the lighter hued folks is closer to whiteness. It's a proximity to whiteness. So the closer you get to white, you must be right or good or better, right? And so that's why we had to put things like anti-Blackness and white supremacy in this inaugural study series, right? Because we have to be able to name and talk about and think about the narratives that we've been presented with in order to resist against them. Was there one or two that stuck out for you, Nick, and when you facilitate this or when you were first exposed to it?
Number 7, I think always, that one gets me. White people more likely to support the criminal justice system when they think it's disproportionately punitive toward Black people. Because I think so much of anti-racism work and talking about white supremacy, and I know I've done this quite a bit, is you present what racism is, how it plays out, and there's almost, and I've done this, so it would be almost my own assumption that with that knowledge, people would want to work against it. And yet, some people feel better about a system that disproportionately incarcerates Black people, and so there's so much work to do, not only on consciousness raising and being active at dismantling racism, but also in getting our white people to actually feel the humanity they've lost, if that's their perspective. I think it's a way of understanding our dehumanization, because I don't think we can be fully human if we are okay with other people being treated as less than fully human. So that one, I think, speaks a lot.
Absolutely. And know that this is happening real time. So last week I was following, I think, the governor of Missouri, has introduced legislation, or there was a debate about it, about being able to try juveniles as adults if it's a violent crime, right? So that would feed into, number 7. Also number 5, I think of Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old, that allegedly the police thought he was a young adult in a gazebo with a gun when he was a 12-year-old shooting off a BB gun in a gazebo. And they rolled up on him screaming, "Put it down," and didn't even give him enough time to put it down.
Yeah.
Right? So these aren't just things that have happened in the past. They are currently at the heart of policy and legislation that is being proposed.
Yeah.
So,
C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government, created by cable in 1979.
Women.
Yes, yes.
That's where you start.
Yeah.
And as we start with Black women, we know that no movement is done alone. And so again, thank you for giving us language. The next question is for both of you. You make the move from allyship to co-conspiratorship. So the question I want you to sit with is, can you identify, once Dr. Love gives us a definition, can you identify a co-conspirator that you've had in your work? And can you break down for us this difference between an ally and a co-conspirator?
Yeah, so
I bet you can.
so the book is about like this idea of abolitionist teaching, right? And so shout out to upstate New York. I'm from upstate New York. We don't like New Yorkers, but that's okay. Yeah. 'Cause when you're from upstate New York, like where are you from? I'm from upstate. Queens? No. Brooklyn? No. Albany? No, I'm from upstate New York, Rochester, New York, 90 miles from Canada, right? And so, so we had abolitionists in upstate New York. That's where I grew up. And the one thing about an abolitionist had to be a co-conspirator. I mean, I want y'all for a second to just think about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad freed over 100,000 enslaved Africans and Black folks, right? Think about this. There was no Twitter. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. This was all off trust and love of each other. And to say that this system of racism and bondage, no more.
Yeah.
We did that. It was everyday people. Farmers, bankers, doctors, teachers, nurses, all ethnicities. We did that as a country. Someone came to your door, gave you a code, you just had to trust them. And so I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsom. Bree Newsom was the young Black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think this is an important story, because Bree Newsom and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said, that flag is coming down. They said, and a Black woman's gonna take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsom and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsom climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like, Bree, they coming, Bree. Hey, Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Tase the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole And he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved her life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. Right? I always say allies make black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? Like, damn, I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. Like, you know, I've been busy being black. Right? So I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. Right? So they come and they know everything and they good. And then after the meeting, you're like, well, what we gonna do? They go, you're like, hey, they left already? Where'd they go?
I'm gonna call an Uber.
I'm gonna call it Uber, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is that back to that abolitionist, is to put something on the line for somebody.
Yeah.
Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And it just, your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right, cash out. It's gonna come right back. And so to be a co-conspirator, I try to write in the book, is to take risks for somebody. To put something on the line, but to use it in a way in which where you're using your privilege.
Yeah.
Yes.
Use it. And I'm not just talking about white folks, I'm talking about cisgender folks. Use it for trans folks, like use it for queer folks.
Yeah.
Like, put something on the line, take a risk. It doesn't have to be small risk, big risk. James Tyson simply said here, put his hand on the pole. That's it. And that's what we are talking about with co-conspirators. Allies, they know everything, they can say, they can talk it. But when it's time, they're not there. And if they're there, they're looking at you like, you going? Oh, you go. You go on the front lines, right? Black folks and brown folks, we don't want to fight racism. The Creator did not put me here to fight racism.
Yeah.
If you believe that, that's racist. I should be here and be in my full life and be my full self and my full human.
Yes.
But I gotta fight what y'all created. So they gotta come to the table with something more than just, I read the new book.
Right.
Right? Take a risk.
Let's talk about that clip. Let's talk about Dr. Benita L. Love and the way she articulated the difference between allyship and co-conspiratorship and putting skin in the game and spending your whiteness that keeps replenishing. Talk to us about that.
I'm not sure what I could say that would be more powerful than that. I mean, that video just, man, Dr. Love just gets right at it. And what I'll say is I really appreciate the language that Dr. Love uses of risk, because I think when a lot of white folks start doing this work intentionally and actively, we believe that we can do it, saving something of who we are and where we've been and where we've come from. That's not the case. You know, we're going to lose something of ourselves, because where we are right now is built on the legacy of all the things we've been talking about. For the folks at Stevens College in Missouri, one of the things that we do with Roots of Justice before we do any training conversation is a land acknowledgement. And so, how many of you, wherever you are, not just Missouri, actually, wherever you're tuning in from, how many of you know the land that you're currently colonizing? And how many of you understand that you're colonizing someone else's land? You know, we breeze over this stuff, but to do the work as a co-conspirator, as somebody who is truly working for liberation from white supremacy, we need to understand that there will be some loss of what we've attached ourselves to, identity-wise, materialism-wise. That's a sacrifice and a risk. And for me, when I hear Dr. Love speak, I mean, there's no option. That's something that I have to do. I can't imagine not. As well as I know myself now, and as well as I'm learning how to be more fully human, I don't want to go backward. That's the only way forward for me. And so there's a beauty in that. We hear loss and sacrifice, and I think a lot of folks get scared. And sometimes it is scary. We don't know what we'll lose. We don't know what we have to sacrifice exactly. But that's what the work demands. If we believe in liberation and justice and a society that celebrates and affirms all people, then we need to accept the beauty of uncomfortable growth through that risk and sacrifice towards what we want.
Absolutely. And I either emailed or called you or texted you something. And I said, oh, that quote was so life affirming at the end, when she said, I wasn't put on this earth to fight racism. Like, I should just be already operating on the earth in my full human self, living life. But, she pauses and then she says, and I gotta fight. Right. And I was like, wow, I hadn't really heard that articulated in that way, to say that if you think fighting racism or sexism or heterosexism is the job of the people in the disadvantaged group, like if you think we just woke up loving that and wanting that, no, we've embraced the fact that we've got to fight for something that we want.
Yep.
Right. Because we're not just going to sit and wait for other folks to do it. So yes, we look like, I'm using all my gifts and talents, right, to make more inclusive spaces everywhere I go. So absolutely. The truth of it is, I wish since 1976, I could have just explored Shaashawn, right? And just have been operating as my queer army brat, natural hair rocking self to see where that took me, right? Instead of coming to a place where I'm embracing being a DEI professional. Grateful, but very different existences. Absolutely. And I appreciated that she named that, right? And that's why she's saying white folks got to spend that whiteness. It's going to come back, right? Because it's in all these US social institutions. So even when you spend it, it's not like you're depleted. Other opportunities, other access, other forms of power are gonna come your way. So it's more of consistently spending it. And I think that's so crucial to name when there is more prevalence of folks talking about power sharing, since Breonna Taylor and Rashad and George Floyd. And I think that literally scares the whatever out of people.
Yep.
Because they think if they spend it, then now they're going to be out or destitute.
Yeah. And I can speak to personal experience for that. Sometimes I name organizations because I believe in being transparent. Sometimes I don't. I won't today just because of the format. But the organization I used to work for, Shaashawn, which you do know, I was at a nonprofit and I was hired to do anti-racism work. And I had some conflict about that as a white man getting paid to do anti-racism work. And I also had bills to pay. So I justified it by knowing I had bills. And also by making sure at every chance that I was provided, and even if I wasn't provided the chance, every time I could, I would speak to the internalized perpetuation of racism at this organization, a predominantly white nonprofit. And I eventually got fired because they didn't like what I had to say. They wanted to look like they were anti-racist, but not actually do the work internally. And so that's a sign of being a white person trying to do the work. I did it and I got fired. And what Dr. Love is saying is so true, because when people found out, I had all kinds of contacts saying, hey, send me your application, give me an email, let me know if you need any help. I had resources and places to go, which is that replenishment of whiteness, right? And so even there was trauma. There was a lot of bad feelings. Nobody wants to get fired, and anybody who's been knows how harmful it can be. And so, but the whiteness replenished itself. So I had that personal stuff to work through, but the whiteness replenished itself, like that. People reaching out to me, buying me beers, and so that's exactly what she's talking about there, right? And so the more we are willing to push ourselves out there, and I'm not suggesting anybody lose their job or whatever, but at the same time, we need to figure out ways that we can take active risks towards the dismantling of white supremacy, because otherwise it's just going to keep rolling on.
Yes. And thank you for naming that. It's challenging. Again, not either or thinking, busting through that. It was a personal loss for you. Like you said, nobody wants to get fired. Nobody wants to lose a status. Nobody wants to have to change your email or, now go tell everybody I'm no longer, contributing my gifts and talents to this organization. So it came at a personal cost to you. Yep. I just want to make sure our Stevens community hears that we're not saying that that's not challenging or frustrating or heartbreaking. At the same time, the opportunities, resources, and ability to have power came to Nick fairly quickly.
Yep, quickly.
Right? So thank you for that. And thank you so much for exposing our community to the Dr. Bettina L. Love. We appreciate that. And there was images of her book up. So again, if you're looking for what's next steps, go buy her book. Go Google her and see what other places have been recorded of her sharing her knowledge and sharing her gifts and her talents and her lived experience. So where do we go from here, right? Endurance, right? Looking at the micro, macro levels, different things. How do we look at it? Where's white supremacy? How and where, to what extent, is it showing up in our personnel policies, in our programs, in our perceived policies, in our procedures, in our protocols, the unofficial hush-hush stuff that isn't written anywhere, but you'll figure out in those first 2 to 3 weeks of employment for sure, or the 2 to 3 weeks you're a student. What is the vision and the mission? Who are we accountable to, right? How are structures mimicking or perpetuating or being complicit in white supremacy? How are structures dismantling that? Right? How are we decolonizing our curriculum? Right? I mean, if we think about vision and mission, we're unapologetically, educating women. So how are we doing that? And how is white supremacy showing up? Right? And Nick and I chose the slide too, because we wanted to acknowledge, highlight, bring attention to the fact that racism is so not cognitive, but in my own lived experience, I've had too many white people tell me that it's cognitive, right? That I should be able to read something and distance myself from it, or I should be able to know someone's intent and then therefore separate that, right? That this is stressful. This leads into healthcare disparities and inequities. That when you are navigating as the disadvantaged, the unseen, the non-celebrated, the non-groomed, the not given second chances, the reprimanded harshly, when you're in those groups, that is stress on your mental health. That is stress on your physical health. And racism is no different. It impacts mental health. So I missed this. I wasn't aware of this. On March 2nd, but we want to lift up and encourage, those who are dealing with diagnosed mental health, those who don't, or just the mental health of stress that comes from racism. So we also want to remember and remind you that Black Lives Matter. And Nick, talk to me around that. So you do a lot of facilitation, you do a lot of co-facilitation with folks of color. The audiences or participants in those groups vary differently depending on the region. I know I've gotten to see you twice now when you have come out to Kansas City to do different facilitations. And so what have been some of your experiences specifically since, March, middle of March with the pandemic, and then, May 25th and beyond since George Floyd?
Experiences facilitating
or just in general, like what can you point out, 1 or 2 or 3 things that have impacted your journey, right? Your own personal journey or your journey as a facilitator?
Well, yeah, so definitely the COVID pandemic really helped reframe my understanding of racism as a pandemic as well. I mean, we're dealing with multiple pandemics, especially in terms of the mental health issue among any other ways of understanding racism as a pandemic. And so it's been complex. I mean, the session I did this morning, we looked at the socialization model, and people were saying it's just like being constantly bombarded, and so there's a tendency to kind of want to shrink back. And I think yes, and for white folks we can. And I think in relation to what your last slide was, Shaashawn, and you talked about you can escape. That's something that white folks need to understand, is that we can literally step away and not have to worry about it. No one's going to, that's it. We can step away and not have to worry about it at all. And so that tendency to shrink down is actually an avoidance mechanism, not necessarily a safety one, because white people often confuse safety with comfort. And so we think we're not safe, and we need to protect ourselves, and so we'll shrink back a little bit. But that's a time to be aware of what we're doing and step up. I think what I really noticed a lot this spring was after George Floyd was murdered. It was within a few weeks after that Breonna Taylor's name became well known, even though she was murdered before George Floyd. There's sexism even in how our society deals with the violence of white supremacy, and so that was another sign of that. But I also began to see the ways that white supremacy morphs and takes different shapes to survive. The enslavement of folks in the 1800s, the way we understood slavery changed, right? And so incarceration began, and it's really snapshotting history, but mass incarceration began now. It's a new way of doing slavery. So white supremacy is constantly morphing. And so after those murders this spring, Black Lives Matter became no longer a radical thing to say, a radical belief. White people and white institutions all over the place were throwing up signs and shirts and hashtags without, and you said the word earlier, with no accountability. And so I think it makes our work harder because now we're not, because where the work used to be, we have to understand why Black Lives Matter and having that conversation. Now the work is, well, okay, you say Black Lives Matter, but you don't really mean it. It's like all the colleges and nonprofits, not just colleges, obviously, but nonprofits and churches that have value and diversity statements. You know, we value diversity, we don't discriminate against, but yet they still adhere to the tenets of white supremacy and all the characteristics that come with that. And so the conversation began to shift from really trying to get people to understand why we need to say Black Lives Matter to why we need to say, well, it's not enough to say that. You have to show it somehow. And it's a shift, and it's been a challenge, I think, because a lot of folks will want to just think that it's enough. That once we say Black Lives Matter, we've done our work. Once we say we value all people, even though we're asking them to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, think a certain way, learn a certain way, we say we value all people, we've done enough. And so it kind of makes the work for justice hard, because you have to keep evolving how you approach these things, the language that you use. So that's kind of what I've been feeling.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you make me think of, I think I told you when we talked that I was rereading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. And I'm at the chapter again where I had like another aha moment when she was talking about, I guess in big terms, you could do covert and overt, but it's so much more layered than that. But it's around the time where she talks about, the civil rights movement in the 60s made certain things not okay. So people knew not to say something, right? Or they knew not to do an overt act, but that doesn't mean that the sentiment was gone or the socialization or the teachings were gone. And so then that stuff just shifted or morphed or started to look a little different. And then she even talked about this dynamic, which is someone who spent the majority of her life on the East Coast. She talked about the Northerners running down and saying, "Oh, you racist Southerners."
Yeah.
Right? Because they were really saying slap on the hand for all these overt stuff. But the covert, honestly, could be claimed and could win Academy Awards or Oscars or some NAACP award for white folks in the North. Because they were still carrying some of those sentiments. They just said, we just don't do the overt stuff. But now it became, you know, over time, the hiring practices, the implicit bias, the classism, right? So the tethering of classism and racism, it started to look different. And so I just was like, wow, as you said, when these movements happen, normally the narrative only celebrates the gains. Mm-hmm. And we don't acknowledge that there were still losses, and specifically for the people with the lived experience.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so thanks for doing that. So we are near our conclusion, and we're going to try to jump in the chat real quick, but we will do a follow-up email. We'll provide a lot of the links to some of the articles that we exposed you to. I'll put these links in there. Some of these are very specific to Missouri. So one of them talks about covenant contracts and the fact that back in, I think it's 2018, there was at least 80 that were found on the books that were property deeds that said this land cannot be owned, right, by a Black person. So again, bringing home this fact that white supremacy isn't just a concept that we've exposed in this series. You know, it was mandated through a U.S. social institution and showed up in things like redlining and property covenants and which neighborhoods were completely destroyed, right? Like the Sharp End in Columbia, Missouri. You can still do the Heart of Missouri United Way. I think we're into week 6 now. And you can still go catch up on previous weeks. And of course, the University of Missouri still has their 10-day self-guided curriculum that you can, you know, commit to do. My data manipulators and researchers, you can go to the Boone Indicators dashboard. And I've added this one, and I had shared this with our digital film major staff, faculty, and our Masters in Fine Arts. So shout out to those faculty, and they embrace this, but there's a call for submissions. And when I read this was in the city government Columbia, Missouri Arts email newsletter that they send out. So I read it, right? And initially I went, oh, because it was about a gentleman in Moscow. But then I read this line that said, okay, it's a call for submissions, an art exhibit, and they're looking for mid-Missouri artists age 16 and older to contribute works that explore the experiences of isolation and confinement. And so I thought, oh, my work in my own identities and as an aspiring ally is to get this to as many, you know, folks of color, LGBTQ, folks with disabilities, veterans, right? Marginalized groups, to say they know about some isolation and some confinement. So let me give them the opportunity to do that. So we'll put this in the follow-up email as well. But those, again, is how you show up and use your whiteness, is even look at something that may be or appear to be specifically for white folks, and then you go share that opportunity or resources with folks who are not white, right? But we are calling you to do the work. Do the work. So coming up will be our last webinar, the 9 of 9, and it's going to be on sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, attraction, and behaviors by Dre Seha, who is the Director of Training and Education for the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania. So it's more of my Pennsylvania to Missouri connections. And Dre will be here to walk us through some fantastic information and concepts, right? And especially talking about a movement that has moved so fast that many people have just decided to retreat, right? Whether it's the alphabet, LGBTQIAA, PPDS-2+, and people go, not doing it, instead of engaging, right? Or whether it's resisting the teaching that we got that everything was binary, that the 7 billion of us fit into one of 2 categories in every areas of our lives, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So we're going to show up and we're going to resist that teaching and we're going to learn. So what I'm going to do now is stop the share and quickly go to the chat and see. Thank you so much for those of you who've been here. It's 1:32 p.m. So we know many of you, have to depart. We're only going to be maybe another 5 or 10 minutes, but we just wanted to acknowledge our contributions in the chat. So we want to thank Anne, who's highly recommending Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, C-A-S-T-E. And Anne says that it was just published. It's wonderful. And also is acknowledging the historic announcement and selection for the vice presidential ticket. And Anne is saying that when they went to Stevens, it was completely segregated and there was a large Southern white presence. Anne was happy to go to the University of Kansas, which had a large international body, plus African-American and Jewish. So thank you so much for encouraging us to continue to make sure we are an institution for all women. Thank you. Courtney is talking about the definition of white supremacy and that this is a definition that many in Kansas City have rallied around in the work and in their organizations. There's about 500 individuals who attended a 2-day Racial Equity Institute over a 2-year period. And the goal was to create common language to use through the metro area. Awesome. So thank you so much, Courtney, for sharing that. And that gives us an example, Nick, right? Of like individual work simultaneously, doing individual work, interpersonal work, communal work, organizational work. Angie contributed. One thing I noticed is people getting caught up about talking about white supremacy is separating whether we're talking about believing in it as a doctrine or whether we are talking about whether it exists and has influence over us all. So thank you so much, Angie, for sharing that. Bree Newsom spoke at Mizzou a couple years ago, Nick. Angie just popped that in the chat.
Nice.
So that's awesome. Sorry I missed Bree when Bree was here. Sue said, we said Black Lives Matter. We never said only Black Lives Matter. We know all lives matter. We just need your help with Black lives that are in danger. Yes. Sarah Crosby, who was one of our facilitators earlier in the series, Nick, on allyship and partnership, says, thank you for your vulnerability, Nick, and your honesty in sharing your knowledge and lived experiences with our community.
Good. Thank you.
And then Angie also said another resource that any of us could go look up was Lee Atwater recording, where he explicitly outlines the national institutional transition from overt to covert racist policies. Right. So thank you all for sharing such good opportunities for us to continue our learning. And I do know that that's challenging for some folks, Nick, when we talk about U.S. social institutions and that overwhelming thing. But there's an example, right? That folks who had access, resources, they were in positions of power, and they were able to explicitly, in writing, in speeches, talk about the war on drugs was absolutely targeted towards Black folks, right? Or the criminalization of hemp was specifically targeted to Mexican Americans, right? Or, the harmful things that have been done to women. So yeah, thank you all for acknowledging that. Nick, thank you so much for showing up, showing out, for working on this organically with me, and continuing, showing up and being who you are. What do you want to leave our Stevens community with? A couple thoughts. I know, I put you on the spot.
That's okay. I'll go back to Dr. Love. Just risk something. It's essential, and I'll tell you, it's actually beautiful. It's beautiful as a personal journey and transition into the liberatory spaces we want to occupy. To put yourself in a position where you're risking, I think it's actually life-giving. Scary, but you don't feel more alive. And obviously, it's not just about you, but I want to help folks understand it's worth it to take a risk.
Yes. Thank you. And I want to share that, so much of this is about the work on the different levels. It's also about how much relationships can heal. So Nick has heard this before, and Nick is partially not. You've experienced him today, and I hope that it resonated with you the way it does with me. But I have literally told him to his face that he has been part of my racial healing journey, because Nick has said things in public spaces that I had never ever heard a white male say. And and so the fact that in doing this work, not only is he breaking down concepts or using tools like the continuum of anti-racism, which to this day, I still think you do that better than half the facilitators I've ever seen, of really saying, this is how this shows up, looking at a tool and saying, oh, from the third column to the fifth column, this is the stuff you're gonna hear. This is the stuff that you're gonna see. Right? This is how an organization will shift. This is how a culture will change when you're on this journey. But it was also the things that you have shared about your socialization and your coming into masculinity, or when you first were a leader and you were supervising Black women and some of the, and Puerto Rican women, and some of the experiences that you said that you went back and issued them apologies. Right? As you had aha moments of, oh, this was how my bias or prejudice was showing up in this exchange. Mm-hmm. And so I thank you publicly, because I thanked you privately, of just being and doing the work and being an aspiring ally and an aspiring co-conspirator, because I have been able to continue in this work when that tank is empty, when I'm over it, to be able to know that it is because of the relationship with you being a student in some of your sessions, and then also co-facilitating with you. So it's about relationship. Yeah. And I will share that this is how relationship shows up, right? Yeah. When you get 15 minutes, when Nick and his amazing wife, Allison, were traveling through Colombia, and he said, I have to see you. I don't care if it's 15 minutes. Because I had an obligation that I needed to get to, and they were traveling. And so we met in the parking lot of a restaurant in Colombia in order to hug on each other and talk. And then they really, really blessed me because they brought me favorite snacks from Pennsylvania. So it doesn't have to be tears all the time either. Yeah. It can be hugs and love and check-ins and check-ons. And it can be me sharing one of Nick's posts, because he articulated his festivity or his shock or disappointment or excitement in doing this work, and then vice versa, right? And he's been in the audience and showed up for me when my intersections are challenging of being Black and queer. And he's been on the Capitol steps giving me eye contact and saying, I love the way you worded that. Or he texts me later and says, I just appreciate you being you and how you show up for all your communities. Or I acknowledge that you've grown. And then we've challenged each other on some stuff, right? Because he's not a fan of the cage of oppression, y'all. So we've had that talk before too. And he's like, yeah, I don't like that tool. I'll create my own. And so we've been to be able to go around and do that. So I say that long monologue or soliloquy to just say, I adore you. I love you. I'm so grateful that we are navigating this world at the same time, same space. And let's keep doing the work.
Absolutely. I love you too, and honored. Thank you, Shaashawn.
So thank you for blessing the Stevens community. Stevens community, thank you for continuing to show up and participate in this series. One more next week, and we look forward to it. But in the meantime, we will co-draft our follow-up email and get that to you in a couple days. So we wish you mental, physical, spiritual health and wealth, safe journeys and travels from your destinations, and create a great, great, great afternoon, evening, and day tomorrow. Peace, everybody.